If you're going to call the cops on someone, you might want to make sure he doesn't own the land you're standing on. The first thing I remember is the sound, the low ripple of lake water brushing against the wooden dock, the faint buzz of cicadas in the August heat, and then the sharp, rising wail of a police siren cutting through it all like it didn't belong there. I was sitting at the edge of the dock with a $12 folding chair from Walmart, my tackle box open at my feet, the smell of sunscreen and fresh water hanging in the air, when Melissa Harper decided I was a criminal. She stood 10 yards away on the grass, one hand on her hip, the other gripping her phone like she was conducting an orchestra, her voice carrying across the water. He's trespassing. He refuses to join the Lakewood HOA. The way she said HOA made it sound like federal law. I didn't turn around right away. I just reeled in slowly, feeling the gentle resistance of the line, watching the sun bounce off the surface of the lake like shattered glass. The patrol car rolled up behind her, tires crunching over gravel, lights flashing, but no rush, no urgency, just procedure. Melissa straightened her posture the second the officers stepped out, smoothing down her white cardigan like she was about to give a speech. She pointed at me again. That's him. I could feel the eyes from the houses behind us. Wide windows, beige siding, American flags mounted neatly beside front doors. A couple of neighbors stood on their porches pretending to water plants that didn't need watering. I stood up slowly, brushed dust off my jeans, and picked up my keys from the dock. The small silver keychain glinted in the sunlight, the lot number engraved on the back, catching just enough light to matter later. Sir, do you live in this community? One of the officers asked, calm, professional. I looked past him at the lake, at the reflection of Melissa's house sitting pretty on the east bank. 2 stories, blue shutters, rented furniture visible through the big front windows. Not exactly, I said. And I meant it. Melissa let out a short, satisfied laugh under her breath, like she'd just won something. She stepped forward, holding out a neatly stapled packet. He was informed he must join the Lakewood Homeowners Association to access this private lake. He refused. We have rules here. Rules. That word floated in the humid air between us. I glanced at the packet but didn't take it. The paper smelled faintly of fresh ink and self-importance. I could see the bold header, mandatory membership notice. Behind it all, the lake kept moving, slow and patient, like it had seen this before. The officer shifted his weight. Sir, do you have permission to be on this property? Melissa didn't hesitate. He doesn't. I finally turned to face her fully. Sunglasses perched perfectly, hair pinned tight, a confidence built on assumption. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that every board she was standing on, every inch of shoreline she claimed to control, every shingle over her head, traced back to a name she had never bothered to look up. Mine. The siren lights reflected off the water one last time before shutting off, leaving only the sound of wind pushing across the lake and the quiet certainty settling in my chest. She thought she was protecting her community. She had no idea she was about to file a complaint against her own landlord. Melissa stepped closer to the officers, lowering her voice into something polished and rehearsed, the kind of tone people use when they believe the system automatically agrees with them. We have a private homeowners association, she said carefully. Every resident has to register, pay the annual dues, and sign the community access agreement. He has refused. Repeatedly. The word repeatedly floated there as if I had been staging some kind of ongoing rebellion. I could smell the faint scent of her citrus perfume mixing with the lake air as she handed the stapled packet to the officer. He flipped through it slowly, scanning highlighted sections and bold headings. I watched his eyes move, patient, neutral. I had seen that look before. It was the look of someone waiting for something that did not quite add up. Sir, he said to me again, do you have documentation showing you are authorized to use this area? Authorized. That word almost made me smile. I slid my phone out of my pocket, but did not unlock it yet. Instead, I glanced back toward the eastern shoreline where Melissa's house stood, 2,400 square feet of pale blue siding and carefully edged landscaping. The grass was trimmed in perfect lines. The dock was freshly sealed. The hanging flower baskets were new this season. I knew because I had approved the maintenance invoice myself. Melissa crossed her arms. He does not live here, she repeated, louder now, making sure the neighbors could hear. He is trying to avoid the membership fee. That is not how we do things in Lakewood. The cicadas buzzed harder in the trees, as if the heat itself was pressing in on the moment. One of the neighbors shifted on his porch. Another stepped a little closer to the sidewalk. I finally unlocked my phone and scrolled slowly, deliberately, until I reached the folder labeled Lake Properties. I did not show it yet. Timing mattered. The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, do you own this section of shoreline?" Melissa did not hesitate. "The association governs it." Governed. Another interesting choice of words. I bent down and picked up my tackle box, snapping it shut with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. The silver keychain brushed against my palm again, cool and solid. Lot 17B. The same number etched on the dock permit filed with the county 3 years ago. The same number listed on the property tax statements that cleared every January. Melissa was still speaking, explaining how property values depended on compliance, how outsiders could not just show up and treat the lake like public access. Outsiders. I looked around at the manicured lawns, the American flags, the mailboxes lined up like soldiers along the curb. Everything about this place was designed to look orderly, controlled, exclusive. The officer handed the packet back to her. "We just need to verify ownership," he said evenly. Melissa nodded with confidence, as if verification would only confirm what she already believed. That was when I finally raised my phone, the screen bright against the afternoon sun, the county seal visible at the top of the document. I did not hand it over yet. I just held it there between us, like a card in a game she did not realize she had already lost. The sunlight caught the edge of my screen as I turned it toward the officer, and for a second all anyone could see was glare and reflection, Melissa's silhouette distorted in the glass. Then the angle shifted, and the county seal became clear, embossed at the top of the digital document like it carried weight of its own. The officer stepped closer, lowering his sunglasses slightly to read. I did not say anything. Silence has a way of stretching time, and in that stretch, confidence either grows or it cracks. Melissa's posture changed first. Not dramatically, just a subtle tightening in her jaw. "What is that supposed to prove?" she asked, still projecting calm. But her voice had lost its earlier polish. The officer scanned the first page, then the second. The breeze lifted a corner of Melissa's packet, pages fluttering against her hand. Across the lake, a pontoon boat drifted slowly past, music playing faintly, unaware that governance of the shoreline was being reconsidered in real time. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "this document lists you as the titled owner of Lot 17B. I nodded once. "Yes, sir." He continued reading. "Including shoreline access extending 20 feet from the dock and shared easement rights for adjacent parcels." Melissa blinked. "That is not possible," she said quickly. "The association controls the shoreline." Controls. There it was again. I shifted my weight and finally slipped my phone fully into his hand so he could scroll himself. He did. Property tax receipts. Recorded deed. Purchase date from 3 years ago. The transfer was clean, notarized, filed with the county clerk. Everything boring and official, exactly the way ownership is supposed to be. The officer handed the phone back to me with a neutral expression that leaned slightly toward understanding. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Melissa, "do you personally own your residence?" That question landed heavier than the others. Melissa hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. "I rent," she answered, lifting her chin. "But that is irrelevant. The HOA governs community standards." The cicadas seemed louder now, like static building in the background. I looked past her again at the pale blue house with the blue shutters. 2,400 square feet. 3 bedrooms. 2.5 baths. A 2-car garage with a keypad I had personally reset last spring after the previous tenant moved out. "Who is your landlord?" the officer asked. Melissa opened her mouth, then paused. "It is held by an investment group," she said vaguely. "Caldwell Property Holdings." The officer read from the lease agreement she had just pulled up on her own phone, trying to prove residency. Her eyes flicked up at me for the first time with something other than superiority. Recognition had not fully formed yet, but it was trying to. The air felt different now, less certain. I slipped my silver keychain into my pocket and met her gaze evenly. "That investment group," I said calmly, "would be me." The words did not need volume. They only needed accuracy. The lake kept moving behind us, steady and indifferent, as the foundation under her authority began to shift in a way she had not prepared for. The word hung there between us like humidity before a storm. That investment group would be me. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Melissa stared at me as if I had just spoken in a language she almost understood but did not want to. That is not possible, she said, but this time it came out softer, less certain. The officer shifted his attention fully to her. Ma'am, your lease lists Caldwell Property Holdings as the owner. This gentleman's documentation shows he is the registered principal. He spoke in the same even tone he had used from the beginning, but the direction of his eye contact had changed. That was the only shift that mattered. A breeze rolled across the lake, pushing small waves against the dock posts with a steady knocking sound. Wood against water, patient and repetitive. Melissa looked down at her phone again, scrolling quickly now, her confidence unraveling in quiet increments. There must be some mistake, she said. The association manages everything. We were told the shoreline was community-controlled. I let that sit for a moment. Managed. Controlled. Words that sound powerful until they meet a deed recorded at the county courthouse. The association manages guidelines, I said calmly. It does not supersede property ownership. The officer nodded slightly. Homeowners associations cannot override county recorded deeds without proper legal authority. He added, not taking sides, just stating fact. Across the street, one of the neighbors lowered his watering hose completely. No one pretended anymore. Melissa's shoulders tightened beneath her cardigan. The packet of rules in her hand suddenly looked thin, almost decorative. You never informed the board, she said, grasping for footing. You never attended meetings. I almost smiled at that. I do not attend meetings for property I own and lease, I replied. I review financial statements. Quietly, the lake reflected the late afternoon sun in long streaks of gold now, the heat easing slightly, but the tension sharpening. The officer cleared his throat. Sir, are you requesting that she be cited for false reporting? The question surprised Melissa more than it did me. Her head turned quickly toward him. False reporting? I was protecting our community. Protecting. I looked at her evenly. You called law enforcement on the legal owner of the shoreline for accessing his own property, I said. That is not protection. That is assumption. The officer held up a hand gently. Let us keep this civil. It already was. That was the part she had not anticipated. There was no shouting, no scene, no dramatic outburst. Just documentation layered against accusation. Melissa's gaze shifted back to me, and for the first time since the patrol car arrived, she looked uncertain. Not embarrassed. Not angry. Uncertain. The foundation under her authority had cracked, and she could feel it. The cicadas continued their steady rhythm in the trees as the officer stepped slightly aside to make a note on his tablet. Procedure. Paper trail. The same system she trusted a few minutes ago was now recording a different version of events, one that listed me not as a trespasser, but as the titled owner. And the lake, indifferent as ever, kept moving in slow, quiet circles. The officer finished typing and looked up, his expression measured but no longer neutral in the way it had been before. Ma'am, he said, addressing Melissa directly. Based on the documentation provided, he is within his legal rights to access this portion of the shoreline. The words were simple, almost routine, yet they carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Melissa opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. The packet of association rules sagged slightly in her hand, no longer a weapon, just paper. The late afternoon sun had dipped lower now, casting longer shadows across the grass, stretching the dock's outline across the water like a dividing line that had always been there. But the board voted, she insisted quietly. We voted to require membership for anyone using the lake. I tilted my head slightly. A vote does not override a recorded deed, I said. I kept my tone even, not confrontational, just factual. The officer nodded once more. If there is a civil dispute regarding association bylaws, that would need to be handled through proper legal channels. It is not a criminal matter. Criminal. That word seemed to echo differently now than it had 20 minutes earlier when she first pointed at me. A neighbor across the street cleared his throat awkwardly and stepped back toward his front door. The small audience that had gathered began to thin out, interest fading as certainty shifted. Melissa's shoulders dropped just enough to notice. I was told the shoreline was community property, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. I watched her carefully. There it was. Not authority. Not control. just reliance on what she had been told. Community guidelines are not the same as ownership, I replied. And ownership is recorded, not voted. The officer slipped his tablet back into its holder. There will be no citation issued today, he said calmly. I recommend both parties review the association documents and property records to avoid further misunderstandings. Further misunderstandings. It was a polite way of saying this should not have happened. Melissa nodded stiffly, though her eyes did not meet mine. The patrol car lights flickered once as the engine started again. No siren this time. Just the low hum of departure. Gravel crunched under the tires as the vehicle rolled away, leaving behind nothing but quiet and the steady sound of water against wood. I stood there for a moment, feeling the tension drain from the air like heat after a storm. Melissa remained near the edge of the grass, staring at the lake as if it had betrayed her personally. I picked up my folding chair and set it back down at the edge of the dock, unhurried. The fishing line was still in the water, drifting gently, patient. I did not look at her when I spoke next. If you have concerns about access or bylaws, I said evenly, you can send them in writing. It was not a threat. It was procedure, and procedure, when followed carefully, tends to favor whoever keeps records. The lake reflected the fading light in long amber streaks, steady and unchanged. Authority had not shifted because of volume or confrontation. It had shifted because the paperwork said it had always been mine. Melissa did not say anything else that afternoon. She gathered her packet of rules, pressed the papers flat against her chest as if holding them there could restore their authority, and walked back across the grass toward the pale blue house on the east bank. I watched her go, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, just with awareness. Moments like that are quieter than people expect. There is no applause, no dramatic music, just the sound of a screen door closing and the steady rhythm of water against wood. I lowered myself back into my folding chair and picked up the fishing rod, feeling the cork handle warm from the sun. The line drifted where I had left it, patient, undisturbed. A dragonfly skimmed across the surface, wings catching the light in quick flashes of silver. The lake did not care who owned it, but the paperwork did. And paperwork, in communities like this, always has the final word. About 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated softly in my hand. An email notification. I did not need to look to know what it was. Still, I opened it. The subject line read, Urgent Board Meeting Request. Sender, Melissa Harper. The message was brief, formal, carefully worded. She requested clarification regarding shoreline authority and ownership boundaries. Clarification. That was a different tone from trespassing. I leaned back in the chair and let out a slow breath. The heat of the day was easing into early evening, the sky beginning to soften from bright blue into muted gold. Across the lake, lights flicked on inside her house, one room at a time. I knew that floor plan well. The kitchen faced the water. The living room windows reflected sunset in wide panes. 3 years earlier, when I purchased the property through Caldwell Property Holdings, I had walked that same shoreline with a surveyor, measuring the exact 20-foot extension from the dock. I remembered the smell of fresh lumber when the boards were replaced. I remembered approving the repainting of those shutters. Ownership is not loud. It is built in quiet signatures and steady maintenance. Another vibration interrupted my thoughts. This time it was a text from Daniel, my property manager. He had seen the county record access notification triggered by the document view earlier. Everything okay? He asked. I typed back. Everything is documented. That was all that needed to be said. I cast the line again, the soft arc cutting through the evening air before landing with a gentle ripple. I could feel eyes on me from 1 or 2 houses still, but the tension was different now. Not suspicion, awareness. The kind that spreads slowly through a neighborhood when assumptions collapse. Melissa had believed authority came from a vote and a printed packet. She had not considered that ownership sits deeper than bylaws. As the sun dipped lower and the sky turned the color of burnished copper, I realized something simple. She had called the system to enforce her understanding of control. The system had simply read the records, and the records had spoken in my favor without raising their voice. The next morning the lake looked different, not because anything had changed physically, but because perception had shifted. A thin layer of fog hovered just above the water at sunrise, soft and low, like the surface was keeping its own counsel. I stood on the dock with a cup of black coffee, the wood cool beneath my bare feet, watching the mist lift inch by inch. My phone buzzed before 7 in the morning. Another email from Melissa, this one longer. She explained that after reviewing her lease agreement, she realized the ownership structure had not been fully disclosed to the association board. She requested a formal meeting to clarify boundaries and expectations moving forward. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the bitterness settle. Clarify. Boundaries. Expectations. Words that sound cooperative when they are sent after certainty collapses. By 9 o'clock, Daniel called. I received a voicemail from her, he said. She sounded concerned. Concerned was one way to describe it. Schedule a meeting for Thursday evening, I told him. At the clubhouse. Open attendance. If this was going to be addressed, it would be addressed in the same room where the rules had been voted on. The rest of the morning unfolded quietly. Lawn mowers hummed in the distance. Delivery trucks rolled through the neighborhood. Ordinary suburban life resumed as if sirens had never echoed across the shoreline. Around noon, I walked the perimeter of Lot 17B with the original survey map folded neatly in my hand. The metal boundary markers were still set in the ground where the surveyor had placed them years ago, flush with the soil, almost invisible unless you knew to look. Ownership often hides in small, permanent details like that. By late afternoon, word had spread. A few neighbors nodded differently when I passed by. Not warmer, not colder, just aware. Awareness changes posture. It changes tone. That evening, as the sun dipped again toward the water, Melissa stepped onto her back patio. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply stood there for a moment, looking across the narrow stretch of shoreline that separated her leased home from my dock. Distance measured in maybe 40 feet. Perception measured in something much larger. I could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes. Association bylaws. Lease terms. Authority lines. The lake moved steadily between us, reflecting orange and pink streaks across its surface. No raised voices. No patrol cars. Just quiet recalibration. I set my coffee mug down on the dock railing and took out my phone once more, opening the scanned deed again, not because I needed reassurance, but because documentation has a grounding effect. It reminds you that facts exist whether or not someone agrees with them. Thursday would come. The board would sit around their polished table. The packet of rules would be opened again, but this time, it would be read alongside county records and lease agreements. And in rooms like that, facts do not need to shout. They simply need to be placed on the table and allowed to speak for themselves. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of polished calm that only planned conversations carry. The clubhouse lights were already on when I pulled into the parking lot just before 6. The small brick building sitting neatly between trimmed hedges and a flagpole that barely moved in the warm air. Through the wide front windows, I could see silhouettes gathered around the long, oval table inside. The same table where bylaws were discussed, landscaping budgets were approved, and apparently shoreline authority had been assumed. I stepped out of my truck with a thin leather folder tucked under my arm, the weight of it light but deliberate. Inside were printed copies of the recorded deed, the survey map, property tax receipts, and a highlighted section of the lease agreement tied to Caldwell Property Holdings. Documentation does not need to be thick. It just needs to be precise. When I walked through the clubhouse door, conversation softened but did not stop. Melissa sat halfway down the table, posture straight, hands folded over a legal pad. She did not look at me immediately. Daniel was already there, seated quietly near the end, his laptop open but idle. The board president, a retired accountant named Mr. Halpern, cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he began. His tone was measured, careful. "We are here to clarify shoreline access and ownership boundaries." Clarify again. The word had become a bridge between assumption and reality. I took a seat opposite Melissa and placed the leather folder on the table without opening it yet. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead. Someone shifted in their chair. Mr. Halpern gestured toward me. "We have reviewed preliminary documentation," he said. "However, we would like a full explanation for the record." I nodded once and opened the folder slowly, sliding copies across the table so that each board member had one in front of them. The paper made a soft, unmistakable sound against polished wood. "Lot 17B, I said evenly, "including 20 feet of shoreline extension and adjacent easement rights, is titled under Caldwell Property Holdings. Recorded 3 years ago with the county clerk. Property taxes paid annually. Maintenance approved and funded through the holding company. I did not rush the words. I did not need to. The document spoke alongside me. Melissa finally looked up. Her expression was not hostile now. It was analytical. The board believed shoreline usage required mandatory association membership, she said carefully. Based on prior understanding. Understanding. I glanced toward the survey map, where small metal markers were indicated along the property line. Understanding is not the same as title, I replied. Mr. Halpern adjusted his glasses and studied the deed closely. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of air vents and the occasional shuffle of paper. It appears, he said slowly, that the association does not possess authority over privately deeded shoreline sections without a recorded easement granting such control. He looked up at Melissa. Our vote exceeded our jurisdiction. The word jurisdiction settled into the room with quiet finality. No raised voices. No arguments. Just correction. Melissa lowered her eyes to the document in front of her, fingertips resting lightly on the margin as if feeling the texture might change the text. Outside, beyond the clubhouse windows, the lake reflected the last light of the day, steady and unchanged. Inside, authority was being redefined not by volume, but by ink that had dried years. Earlier, the room remained still for a long moment after Mr. Halpern finished speaking, the kind of stillness that follows a correction nobody expected to need. Papers rested flat on polished wood, survey lines and legal descriptions visible under fluorescent light. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue with. Melissa finally lifted her gaze, not toward me at first, but toward the rest of the board. Then the notice issued for mandatory shoreline membership is invalid, she said quietly. It was not a question. Mr. Halpern nodded once. It appears so. We will need to draft a formal amendment clarifying the limits of association authority. Amendment. Clarifying limits. The language had shifted completely now. Earlier that week, it had been about enforcement. Now it was about boundaries. I closed the leather folder gently, the soft snap echoing just enough to mark the end of my portion of the discussion. For the record, I added evenly, I have no issue with community guidelines that fall within legal scope. Maintenance standards. Noise considerations, shared spaces. But privately deeded shoreline remains privately deeded. No one disagreed. Outside the clubhouse windows, dusk had settled over the lake, the surface reflecting faint lights from dock posts and patio lamps along the shore. It looked the same as it had every evening before. Calm, indifferent. Melissa folded her hands together again, but this time there was no edge in her posture. I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier this week, she said, directing the words toward the table rather than directly at me. It was careful, measured, but real. The call to law enforcement was premature. Premature. That was one way to put it. I inclined my head slightly. Documentation resolves most misunderstandings, I replied. Daniel closed his laptop quietly. Mr. Halpern made a final note. We will circulate updated language to all residents, he said. Effective immediately, the association acknowledges recorded property deeds as controlling authority over shoreline parcels. Controlling authority. This time the phrase was aligned with fact. Chairs shifted as the meeting adjourned. People stood, gathering their papers with subdued efficiency. There was no drama, no confrontation, no raised voices echoing in the hallway. Just correction filed into the minutes. As I stepped outside, the night air felt cooler, carrying the faint scent of water and cut grass. Across the darkened shoreline, Lot 17B sat exactly where it always had, wooden dock. Extending 20 feet into still water, metal boundary markers embedded quietly in soil. Nothing about the land had changed. Only the understanding of it had. A porch light flicked on at Melissa's rental as I walked toward my truck. For a brief second, our eyes met across the distance. There was no hostility there now, just awareness. The kind that settles in after assumption meets record. I drove home slowly along the curved neighborhood road, windows down, warm air moving through the cab. Authority had not been reclaimed with volume or spectacle. It had been reaffirmed with ink, dates, and signatures already on file. The lake would look the same tomorrow morning. The dock would still creak softly under shifting weight. And every time I stepped onto that shoreline, I would do so without needing permission from anyone who had mistaken a vote for ownership. Justice, I had learned, does not announce itself. It waits in the records, patient and inevitable.